Well, Singapore is a very unique society which is very hard to understand. And I can tell you the Western media gets it completely wrong, because if you read the Western media, you get the impression that Singapore is just a nicer version of North Korea. You know, everybody's suppressed, oppressed, and so on and so forth. Guess what? You know, virtually every Singaporean travels overseas every year and comes back to Singapore. So obviously this is not an oppressive state. The reason why Singapore has restrictions on press freedom is precisely because of the 1964 ethnic riots that Singapore experienced. We've seen in many other countries, press freedom, like in Rwanda, leads to hate speak against minorities. We want to ensure that that doesn't happen in Singapore, and therefore there are these restrictions on press freedom in Singapore. But on the question of civil liberties, there's a very important point that Americans should bear in mind when they speak about civil liberties. You know, one of the big shocks that the world experienced after 9/11 was when they watched America, the world's most advanced, open democratic society, walk back from some civil liberties as soon as they began to feel insecure. And because they were frightened of terrorists, they said, I'm happy to give up my privacy. Come have surveillance cameras everywhere. I'm not worried. I want my safety and security. Now, if America, the world's most powerful country, is prepared to give up some of its civil liberties in exchange for security, right? Then you begin to understand why smaller and much more vulnerable states like Singapore have also developed a compact with the government that said, okay, we'll give up some of our civil liberties, we'll give up some of our press freedom, but continue to keep this place peaceful and prosperous and strong. And Singapore, by the way, is a small island city-state of 4 million people who are primarily Chinese, surrounded by two neighbors, Malaysia, which has 20 million people or 25 million people, Indonesia, which has 200 million people, and both Malaysia and Indonesia distrust their Chinese minorities. So if you live in that kind of neighborhood, right, you got to make sure that you remain very strong and disciplined. And that's what Singapore needs for its survival. Yes, because if you've had a successful track record, if these limitations have not damaged you in any way, and by the way, there's absolutely no restrictions on flow of information. Singapore, by the way, is much more connected to the broadband than Americans are. The internet is everywhere in Singapore. You can get information on anything you want in Singapore. So believe me, in Singapore, by the way, can only become a leading financial center if it remains completely open to flows of information. And that's why Singapore is succeeding. So there are the flows of information in Singapore. The restrictions are about what you report on domestic politics and on what you report on the race situation in Singapore. But otherwise, there's no other restrictions in Singapore at all.